Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Linux Multimedia Studio tutorial. We're looking at the Linux Multimedia Studio 1.2.0 Release Candidate 5. This is the latest version. It is a release candidate. However, I found that it seems to be pretty stable, at least every bit as stable as the current stable release, at least as far as what I've done with it. I wanted to share with you an idea here that I've had. This is a mock-up of a piece of music you should recognize. It's not exactly note for note, but see if you can place this one here. Very, very well-known little snippet of music. Listen carefully. Okay, so this is obviously the cue from Psycho, called "The Murder." It is the famous shower sequence from the movie Psycho, written by Bernard Herrmann. And I'll tell you why I'm doing this here, and I'll explain what's going on. Again, we're going for realism in our samples here, and I think we get pretty close here. And I have a bit of a surprise for you concerning that in a moment I'll share. But the reason why I did this was I was looking at some other sound libraries that I've been aware of. One that came out about half a year ago that was created by the people at Spitfire Audio. And it's this one here. It's called the Bernard Herrmann Composer Toolkit. It'll set you back about $500 plus tax, and it is it's a sound library made up of samples that are very, very gritty. They have a lot of kind of edgy artifacts to them. They're bowings on the strings that are really, really kind of dirty, and certain articulations that are pretty edgy. It also has some doublings, instrument doublings that are not common, but they're recorded together, and some small ensemble samples that were recorded that kind of line up with the compositional style of Bernard Herrmann. Now, Bernard Herrmann, if you don't know, was the composer for Psycho. He was the film composer that did a lot of Alfred Hitchcock's biggest movies. He's one of my favorite composers. He's been very influential in music, not just film music, but music in general, particularly music that is related to suspense or horror, the horror genre, in terms of radio plays and stories and film and television. Some composers have worked very hard to emulate him very closely. Danny Elfman is actually one that pretty much everything he writes sounds like Bernard Herrmann, and he does that on purpose, and he doesn't really hide that fact. He claims that Bernard Herrmann was one of his, if not his greatest influence in his orchestral writing that he does for film. Now, I thought this was fascinating that they put this sound library out, because ultimately when we're trying to create mock-ups, we're going for realism any way that we can get it. We want our mock-ups to sound as though they have real artifacts in them, sounds that sound human, like a person is playing. We don't want everything to be clean. We want to hear the clicks and the bumps and the grinding, and we want to hear the buzzing and all these kinds of weird things that normally you would want to eliminate from a recording, a live recording. We want to have those things in there because it adds to the sound of our mock-up. And I thought it was fascinating that they made this library that was so over the top in that direction. And it got me to thinking about it. How could I do this in Linux Multimedia Studio with the fewest number of samples? And I kind of made a challenge for myself. And I decided to create something using only a general MIDI sound font. And not only just a general MIDI sound font, but the most common one. I'm using the FluidR3 general MIDI sound font. You can download it here as well as a number of other places. If you use MuseScore, FluidR3 is the default sound font that is in MuseScore that it comes with, and that would be the sounds that you hear. You'll note that the sounds are not very realistic. They are basically just representational. They're close enough so that you get a basic idea as to what your score sounds like as you play it back. Now, the thing about a general MIDI sound font is that usually the sounds are real live samples. They're sound samples that were recorded from real instruments and they're looped and then placed into the Soundfont package. Now the problem with the general MIDI sound font is that you lack articulations. You only have the one articulation that you get and that one loop and that one sound, and there's very few velocity differences, meaning that when you press a key hard and you have a high velocity and you press a key soft, there might only be one or two samples that are different between those two. You don't usually have 5 or 6 or 7 layers of velocity samples. So a general MIDI sound font is supposed to just kind of give you a basic idea as to what it sounds like. But as I was thinking about this Bernard Herrmann thing and this sample library, I got to thinking about what is in a general MIDI sound font. There's a lot of sounds in there that we don't use, or that we don't typically mess around with. A lot of really fascinating sounds. And I was thinking about one in particular, and I was thinking about a sound font or a sound sample in there called a patch called a fret noise. Let me see here if I can find my MIDI here. So that would be this right here, this fret noise, and it sounds like this. And what I believe it is, it's just the sound of fingers going across a guitar strings. And it makes that kind of a sound, the sound of that wisping sound on the string across as it goes from fret to fret. So, that's a sound we never use. But I got to thinking, well, I could use that to help with some of these high string sounds. So I tried it out, and what I did is I used only samples from the FluidR3 general MIDI sound font, and I took the original MIDI data that I had. In fact, I'll show that to you here. This is the original. So the original just looks like this. It's just 2 tracks of strings, and by default it just puts the generic string sound on it. And this is what it sounds like. So there's no effects, and it's only one string sound. And it's just the MIDI data that was entered. It's all quantized very cleanly. Jump over here. No pizzicato. Okay, so I took that and I duplicated all these parts, and I cut out the parts that should be different, the parts that should have a different articulation or a different kind of patch associated with them. And once I did that, then I started to assign sounds and duplication of these tracks. I started to mix and assign sounds that would get me as close to realism as I could, only from that general MIDI sound font. So let's take a look at that real quick and see what's going on in this project here. So, for example, the first sound that I have here is this high strings patch, and the high strings patch is actually synth strings 1. It's actually a synth sound. Okay, so again, following the advice that I've given you before in other projects, you want to use the things that sound right, not necessarily the things that are labeled right. So this is just a synth sound, that is a string synth sound. The next one that I have on here is a tremolo. So a string tremolo sound, the generic one that's in that sound font. Then also on that same MIDI data, I have one that is a violin. And what I did with the violin is I set the pan over, let me see here. It's not that, I did it to the squeaks, never mind. So here's the violin and it's set to the center pan. The next one I had is a fiddle. The FluidR3 Soundfont has a fiddle and a violin. Now, don't ask me what the difference is. The truth of the matter is that on the instrument there's no such thing as a fiddle. A fiddle is a violin. The difference between the two is the music that you play on them. But they had a separate patch for the fiddle, and I believe they are different samples, so I put that on there as well. And then I added in this fret noise. And I allowed the MIDI data that's on there to play this back, but what I did, you can see what the MIDI data looks like normally. This is what it looks like. Everything is lined up on the notes that it's supposed to be executing. What I did is I copied that, I pasted it over, and then I grabbed groups of these and I moved them and shifted them around up and down into different registers, because the fret noise is a non-defined sound. It doesn't really make a tone. It doesn't make a pitch, I should say, even though it is assigned to the keyboard so that different keys will give you different instances and different pitches. It doesn't really have a defined pitch. So I figured we wanted to have this sound change every time that it's executed. So I move them up and down. I also move each articulation left and right so that it's a little bit off here and there. I made one copy of that here, and I put the pan all the way to the right, and then I made another copy of it. Now what I did is on the second copy I changed the pitch. I pitched down the sounds, and then on the one on the top I pitched up those sounds, and I set the pan apart. Then I also went into this one here and I moved around the notes a little bit more so that they're not exactly the same. And then this would give us the idea or the sensation of kind of these stereo artifacts going on inside of the room as this is being executed. Now, in addition to that, I put up here a beat bassline track. On the beat bassline track, I have this automation track that for one measure gives us a automation for the modulation wheel. It causes the wheel to move up on each individual articulation. So in the end, what we end up with is all of these string sounds being assigned to that instance of that modulation wheel automation, and it gives us this sliding effect. So if I take these squeaks out for a moment, let's just solo these tracks up here. This is what we end up with, which sounds pretty good with that mixture and that combination. However, it doesn't sound authentic. It still sounds fairly electronic. So the secret sauce here is to add these squeaks. Now, I have the volume up pretty high on these high ones. I use actually these squeaks on every single one of the tracks here in various ways, and we'll look at that in a moment here. But if I play that back now with that fret noise, you see what it sounds like. And all of a sudden, it sounds quite real. Now, all of this is going down to the effects mixer, and I have all of my effects just on the master. So we have a compressor, a reverb to give us a specific reverb effect that has no fall off or no dissipation of the sound, no resonance. And then I have a calf reverb instance that does have that resonance on it, so 2 instances of reverb. Then I EQ it, and then I have a stereo enhancer effect on the very end. Pretty basic stuff here, okay? And everything pipes in just through that one channel. Let's take a look at some of these other things here. We'll unsolo that. I did the same thing for the low strings. I applied the exact same kind of setup. I used a few combinations of different sounds to get us to the right place. Then down here, there's one arco articulation here that happens right at the end. And what I did is I used some pizzicato sounds. I have the regular pizzicato sound, pizzicato section. Then I have the squeak sound, the fret noise is applied to it as well. And then I have a couple of different instruments. I have a viola on there, I have a tremolo, and I have a cello, and that's it. So everything's all together there to get this one articulation right here at the end of that phrase before it turns over to the low strings, and this is what it sounds like. just kind of that sudden little accented sound there. And then I have the low strings. Now on the low strings I use a pizzicato, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to make this pizzicato sound very diverse and wide. So I used the standard pizzicato sound on the first channel, and then on subsequent ones I used a couple of different sounds. On this one I used a synth string sound, and I took the articulations and I shortened them up, and this is only happening on this one downbeat right here, okay, on that arco sound, now, or on that one sound. Now on the arco sound that I want on the every other pizzicato, I used a viola sample. Now the viola I found as a patch had a really nice kind of artifact right at the beginning of the articulation that sounded really kind of dirty. So I figured I could use that for the whole string section just on these hits right here. Then I have also an instance of the squeak, that fret noise. Another thing about this is that you can move the calibration. That is where it deciphers where the notes are at based on the MIDI data. So I set the center, the tonal center, way up here between C7 and C8 up on this A. And what that does is it takes all the notes and it shifts them down several octaves, and it makes a really low kind of squeaking sound, which is what we want for these lower winds or lower strings. Let's see, what else do I have in here? I have a Yamaha grand piano. And what I did to this piano is on the effects channel I added an EQ, and on the EQ I took out the very high frequency so that I was left with just the tone and a very, very basic essence of an attack there, to try to give it a little bit of an edge, as if there is an accent on the downbeats. Again, you don't have to use what it really is, you just need to get to the sound via the sounds that you have available in the general MIDI sound font, and then effects on top of it. And then the last one is a nylon string guitar. I was thinking I had a harp in there as well. Let me see here. Pizzicato too. Yeah, there's a harp as well. Now what I did is on each one of these I went in and I very slightly moved random notes left and right in time, so that they wouldn't all sound exactly at the same time, and it made a pretty authentic sort of sound here. Let me solo these tracks. You can hear what this sounds like. So these are just the pizzicato and the arco bowings here at the end. So you can hear those multiple attacks and very different sonorities because we have a lot of different sound patches used there. Then on the bass notes, to round this out, I have a little bit of automation right here in the end. This is a volume set up here for a couple of these sounds so that I could get a crescendo on an active release at the very end. I took the notes in each one of these instances and I moved them back and forth so that they don't all line up perfectly. We don't want to have any what we call machine gunning. That is, whenever you have repeating sounds over and over again, you don't want them to sound the same. You want each one to sound a little bit different from the one previous. And what I have here is on the top I have a cello sound. On the next instance I have a contrabass sound. I have these turned up pretty high as the core of the sound, and these are very long durations. I have that automation track assigned to those, and then also to this sound down here, which is the tremolo string sound. In between I have another instance of the contrabass, and what I did is inside of this one I shortened up all the notes, so I have a very, very short attack, and I brought up the velocity on the low sounds on those hits. And then what I did is I turned up the volume just a little bit on that from everything else, so it gives us an accent on each one of the attacks. I found that worked pretty well. Then down here I have another instrument. This is actually a tuba. Now the tuba sound I found gave me a really, really raspy kind of vibration on the low sound, so what I did is I put the tuba on there and then I moved the tonal center so that it would play an octave lower, and it gives us a little bit of that essence of a really, really low rumble. And that works quite nicely. I don't remember if I put any effects on this. No, I did not. It's as is. And then the very last thing I did is I put one more instance of this fret noise down here, and again I moved looks like I left my pitch center right where it was at because the notes are low. I did shift these up and down a little bit to give some variety on the different fret noises, and I set the volume quite low so you just hear a little bit of those artifacts kind of in between the notes around the articulations, as if they're really people in a room and the mics are nice and close. So let's listen to this whole thing again and see if you can hear all of that I did. So hopefully you can hear all of those little details in there, and it adds to the realism. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you a challenge. We're going to call this the FluidR3 challenge. So what I want you to do is get the FluidR3 Soundfont, if you don't have it already, and see if you can create something. It doesn't have to be complicated. But it does have a few rules. I want to make sure that you're only using the FluidR3 Soundfont and any effects that you have available. You don't even have to use Linux Multimedia Studio. You can use any sequencer that you want. Could be a proprietary one. You can use any effects that you want that come with that software. So EQ, reverb, any of those kinds of things to help use your sounds in a very creative way. And I want you to see if you can make something realistic with just that general MIDI sound font. You can use any of the sounds in any combination that you want to get the right sound to sound realistic. Now, a couple of pieces of advice on that. The FluidR3 Soundfont has a lot of different sounds that can be used interchangeably. There are some synth brass sounds. There's a generic brass sound. These sounds will work well sitting in for articulations for horns and trumpets, trombones, and tuba. They work well for combinations of instruments or as an additive. There are also a lot of different string sounds plucked and bowed strings that you can use. There are some bass sounds that can be used for that. There are a lot of synth variations that can be used interchangeably. There are a lot of keyboard sounds. There are even some other percussive sounds. There's a lot of different percussion sounds, quite a few different percussion kits if you dig into the Soundfont. Use these and see if you can make something realistic. It could be something that just uses one or two instruments. We're just going for realism using the smallest set of samples that we can from one sound font. There's one additional restriction on this, is that if we're going for realism on acoustic instruments, we need to make sure that our projects have acoustic instruments in them. So make sure that even if there is a synth variant to it, that you have something that is supposed to be an acoustic sounding instrument in a real space, and see if you can use that sound font to achieve that goal. So the FluidR3 challenge is on. Once you've made your projects, you can link to them here in the comments section. Just give us a comment and give us a link, and we'll listen to them and spread the word and see what we can come up with using some of these really complex MIDI entry tricks inside of our sequencers to use free sounds and make them sound real. So FluidR3 challenge, get to it. Can't wait to see what you come up with. Happy sequencing.